In the 1820s, along the Missouri River, Captain Andrew Henry and his company of trappers established a camp to harvest pelts and leather. Henry instructed their lead trapper, John Fitzgerald, to ready the outfit for departure the following morning. Not far from the camp perimeter, a young trapper named Jim Bridger appeared, seeking assistance to haul a sizable elk he had felled. The others teased him lightly, promising to show up only when supper was served, which lifted the mood for a brief spell. But that ease shattered in an instant when an arrow suddenly buried itself in one of the men's throats. Panic rippled through the camp as the trappers scrambled for cover behind the trees, straining to spot the source of the assault. By the time they detected the shadows shifting, it was already too late. The company was encircled. Assuming the raid was focused on their valuable furs, the captain barked orders to stand firm and protect the stockade. Gunfire cracked through the timber, slicing apart the forest's silence. Hearing the volley from afar, the scout Hugh Glass sprinted back toward camp with his son Hawk. The moment Glass arrived and assessed the chaos, he hollered for everyone to fall back to the boats while maintaining their fire. A few men stayed to shield the retreat, while the remainder dashed for the riverbank. The withdrawal was frantic, and many were cut down along the route. Ultimately, only a small remnant managed to survive, shoving their vessels into the Missouri's current and drifting clear of the slaughter. The attackers were a band of native people known as the Ree. They had no interest in the pelts. They were scouring the territory for their chief's vanished daughter, convinced she had been seized and traded away. Their fury had been simmering for days, compelling them to strike without reservation. Aboard the boat, the survivors remained oblivious to the true motive for the assault. Glass studied the shoreline and counseled the captain to abandon the river, pointing out that it rendered them glaringly exposed. Fitzgerald objected, insisting the waterway offered their swiftest exit and pushing back firmly against the notion. Notwithstanding this dissent, the captain opted to follow Glass' guidance. The verdict stoked friction, most notably with Fitzgerald, whose irritation began curdling into a private grudge. Upon reaching solid ground, the group concealed their furs and braced for an overland trek through the woodland. Fitzgerald continued grumbling under his breath, faulting the captain for the altered route. His vexation soon pivoted toward Glass and his son Hawk. He openly challenged Glass, alluding to whispers that Glass had once slain an officer, implying the deed was done to shield his mixed-blood boy. Before the confrontation could spiral, the captain interceded and defused the standoff. As Fitzgerald stalked off, Glass reproached Hawk, urging him never to rise to such provocations. Later, after dispatching the empty boat downstream as a diversion, the party commenced their arduous march through the wilds. Along the trail, the captain, still piqued by curiosity, inquired of Glass whether the tale of the officer held any truth. Glass offered no reply and simply trudged onward. Later, as the others paused to catch their breath, Glass ventured ahead solo to reconnoiter the terrain. The woods stood still, but then a rustle stirred the undergrowth. He lifted his rifle, poised to fire, only to discover a pair of young bear cubs. Then, without the slightest warning, the mother grizzly attacked. The onslaught was vicious and unrelenting as she mauled and raked him relentlessly. Glass wrestled back, yet he swiftly grasped he could not outmatch her brute force. Instead, he went limp, forcing himself to lie mute in feigned death. After a fraught pause, the bear retreated a step. Barely conscious, Glass groped for his firearm. He mustered what flicker of strength remained and discharged the weapon, striking the bear. But she lunged at him anew, ripping into his gullet and gouging lacerations across his frame. When the chaos stilled, the bear lay dead atop him, while her cubs observed from the thicket nearby. Shortly thereafter, the others detected the gunshot and traced the report. They arrived at the grisly scene and heaved the carcass off Glass. The sight was staggering. His windpipe was laid open, his flesh was riddled with gaping tears, and his limb was grotesquely contorted. Yet, by some miracle, he still drew breath, clinging to the thread. Fitzgerald assessed the scout's condition and proposed a swift end to his agony. But Captain Henry would not forsake his scout. Instead, he did what little he could, forcing Glass into unconsciousness to dull the torment while closing the wounds with whatever supplies were on hand: rags, a needle, and raw spirits. Elsewhere in the forest, the Ree discovered the derelict boat and deduced the party had moved inland. With a fresh bearing, they commenced tracking them through the timber. That evening, their chief convened with a group of French traders to barter. He tendered stolen pelts in exchange for mounts and arms. Initially, the French demurred, loath to part with their horses. But when the chief signaled he would seize them by force if required, they sullenly acquiesced. Back among the trappers, Bridger discreetly removed the grizzly's talons and placed them inside Glass's satchel, clinging to a frail hope that the man might pull through. Over the ensuing days, the trek grew more sluggish and enervating. The men rotated the burden of bearing Glass, inching from one campsite to the next per the captain's directive. Even Fitzgerald complied, though his forbearance was clearly fraying. As they confronted a precipitous ridge, the load became insupportable. Disputes erupted. Several of the men, rallied by Fitzgerald, contended they could not persist under such duress, particularly with the closing in. Left with no palatable option, the captain finally conceded to the stark reality. He steeled himself to terminate Glass's life, perceiving it might be the sole mercy remaining. But when the moment arrived, his nerve failed him. Instead, he announced a bounty $100 to any volunteer willing to stay behind and attend to Glass until the end came. Bridger immediately assented, declaring he would remain without compensation. Hawke followed suit, spurning any payment and electing to abide with his father. Fitzgerald observed the exchange, then spoke up. He agreed to stay as well, but only on the condition that he received the full sum designated for all three. The captain wavered. He distrusted Fitzgerald, yet he was bereft of alternatives. Ultimately, he entrusted Glass to their custody and pressed on with the remainder of the party, bearing the heaviness of that verdict with him. Days elapsed as Glass wavered between vitality and oblivion, his frame scorched with fever. Through the haze of anguish, he heard his son's voice repeating the mantra he himself had once uttered, "Keep fighting while there is breath." As those syllables reverberated, recollection surged forth. Glass relived the incursion when soldiers razed their village, immolating their lodges and slaying his wife. He remembered clutching his wounded boy, commanding him to persevere and resist death at all costs. Now, those identical words were being directed back at him, compelling him to endure. Meanwhile, Fitzgerald's impatience swelled with every sunset. He had already excavated a shallow grave, primed for what he deemed an inescapable conclusion. When Bridger inquired about the state of Glass's scalp, Fitzgerald blithely explained that the Ree had attempted to take it, mistaking him for a corpse. As he narrated this, Bridger fidgeted with his canteen, producing an abrasive scratching sound that abruptly rankled Fitzgerald, prompting him to bark at the boy to cease. Later, while Bridger and Hawke ventured toward the stream to fetch water and angle for fish, Fitzgerald tarried beside Glass. Espying his chance, he bent close and addressed him in low tones. He asserted that they would all perish if they lingered any longer, and he counseled Glass that it was time to relinquish his grip. He then implored Glass to blink if he was prepared to die. Glass wrestled to resist, striving to keep his eyelids pried apart, but his flesh was too enervated. Fitzgerald scrutinized his face, biding his time, and at last, Glass blinked. Taking this as acquiescence, Fitzgerald clamped a rag over Glass's face, endeavoring to smother him. At that precise juncture, Hawke returned and immediately thwarted the act. He shouted for Bridger, who was still some ways distant. Before aid could materialize, Fitzgerald clamped a hand over Hawke's mouth and drove a blade into his gut. Glass could do naught but bear witness. Immobilized and voiceless, he lay prone as his son expired in his sight. By the time dusk descended, Bridger came back with his catch, oblivious to the atrocity. He asked after Hawke, but Fitzgerald deflected the query, feigning ignorance and implying the boy had accompanied Bridger. The young man grew bewildered. Early the following dawn, Fitzgerald roused Bridger in a feigned frenzy, exclaiming that a band of Ree warriors was descending upon them. Terror seized Bridger, leaving him paralyzed by indecision. Without a moment's delay, Fitzgerald hauled Glass over to the open grave and entombed him alive, proclaiming there was no time for ceremony. He then bolted, compelling Bridger to follow suit. Before deserting the site, Bridger hesitated briefly, then surreptitiously left his water flask behind for Glass. Time slipped by, and no sign of any Ree war party materialized. Somehow, Glass began to stir anew. With only a single functional limb and one leg, he painstakingly clawed his way out of the dirt. Every inch of progress was agony, yet he persisted. As he dragged his shattered form forward, he eventually located Hawke's body. He crumpled beside the boy, engulfed by sorrow, and lay there in wordless vigil. The next morning, Fitzgerald readied himself to resume the march, comporting himself as though nothing untoward had occurred. But as he spoke, he inadvertently altered his account, citing a divergent tally of assailants than he had previously claimed. Bridger noted the discrepancy. Suspicion festered, and he leveled his firearm, demanding veracity. Fitzgerald ultimately confessed that no Ree warriors had ever been present. He professed that he had fabricated the threat to salvage both their lives, contending that remaining with Glass would have guaranteed their demise. He even had the audacity to assert Bridger should be beholden to him. Bridger stood trembling, torn between fury and credulity. Perceiving the boy's hesitation, Fitzgerald snatched Bridger's weapon and aimed it at him. Then, without prelude, he squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell upon an empty chamber. Glass slowly cultivated a resolve to survive, fueled by an implacable thirst for retribution. Despite possessing only a single serviceable limb and one leg, he commenced crawling across the forest floor. Along his path, he scavenged for any possible sustenance, tearing morsels from animal offal solely to keep his heart beating. Each trifling motion yielded a fraction more vigor. He pressed forward without cease. Behind him, the Ree warriors eventually overran the deserted camp, comprehending just how near they were to their quarry. The peril was steadily constricting. After an interminable ordeal, Glass gained the Grand River, a tributary feeding the Missouri. He knelt at the water's edge and attempted to swallow, but the gash in his throat allowed the liquid to leak out. Even so, the meager portion he managed to ingest assuaged his thirst marginally. Recognizing that the lesion could not be left untreated, he made an agonizing resolution. He packed gunpowder onto the wound and ignited it, cauterizing the flesh to stanch the bleeding. Days accumulated as he lingered near the riverbank. His body commenced a halting recovery, and for the first time, he succeeded in standing upright, albeit for a fleeting instant. But jeopardy returned swiftly. One afternoon, the Ree arrived at the river, unaware that Glass lay concealed nearby. With no opportunity to secrete himself, he flung his body into the flow and allowed the torrent to sweep him downstream. Arrows and lead balls chased his wake, hissing through the atmosphere, but he evaded them as the water carried him farther from their reach. Once more, he cheated death. Far afield, Fitzgerald and Bridger continued their traverse across the Dakota expanse. At one juncture, they passed through a ravaged village. Amidst the detritus, Bridger spied a native woman and discreetly pressed some food into her hands before moving along, leaving behind a fleeting gesture of compassion. Later that evening, as they supped, Fitzgerald recounted how his father had placed his faith in Providence. One day, his father's unit was ambushed by Indians. Only his father emerged unscathed. But he attributed his survival not to divine intervention, but to action. Days later, famished and isolated, his father spied a squirrel that seemed to materialize as if sent by God. So his father shot it and survived. To Fitzgerald, deliverance was not a matter of supplication, it was a matter of pulling the trigger. In the remote wilds, Glass rested beside the river and descended into a fevered slumber. His dreams amalgamated phantoms of his wife, his incinerated village, and Fitzgerald's sneer into a single unquiet vision. He startled awake and noticed fish marooned in a shallow pool nearby. Without a second thought, he snatched one and consumed it raw, frantic to reclaim his fortitude. Later, he heard a disturbance and traced its origin. From a hidden vantage, he watched a bison herd stampede, harried by wolves. He lay concealed and bided his time until the slaughter concluded, hoping to claim the leavings. That night, however, another figure arrived first. A solitary Pawnee man dispersed the wolves and took possession of the fallen bison. Glass approached circumspectly, signaling no menace and pantomiming his need for sustenance. The man comprehended and portioned out the meat. By the following dawn, the Pawnee perceived the full scope of Glass's injuries. Glass displayed his talon necklace and gestured the tail of the bear. The Pawnee listened in silence, then quietly divulged that his own community had been annihilated. Still, he held that vengeance was not his trail, he intended to travel south to locate whatever remnants of his kin endured. Glass resolved to accompany him, discerning this as his swiftest route onward. Simultaneously, Fitzgerald and Bridger finally reached Fort Kiowa and rejoined the surviving party. As scripted, Fitzgerald deceived Captain Henry, asserting that Hawk had wandered off and that Glass had been interred with proper rites. The captain heeded the account and accepted its veracity. He thanked them for their vigil and tendered the promised remuneration, including a supplement for Bridger. Bridger, however, could not accept the currency. Remorse weighed upon him like a millstone, and without pocketing the coin, he withdrew in silence. Unable to expunge the memory of abandoning Glass alive. As snowfall commenced, Glass and the Pawnee man journeyed jointly through the frozen wastes. Notwithstanding their compounded bereavements, they shared a fleeting reprieve, capturing snowflakes upon their tongues. For a transient interval, the odyssey felt less onerous, yet the blizzard intensified. Inevitably, Glass collapsed amidst the drifts, his body at last capitulating to the elements. Even then, the Pawnee man spurned the thought of desertion. He erected a makeshift shelter and labored to quell Glass's fever, remaining steadfast through the brutal night. Days crept past, and Glass roused once more. Upon waking, he discovered food cached nearby. Discerning that his benefactor had ventured ahead, he pursued the trail, yearning to close the distance. But what he encountered instead halted him dead. The Pawnee man had been slain by a band of French traders, the very same who had dealt with the Ree earlier. Glass hugged the shadows and observed their encampment from afar, biding his time until darkness fell. When the night was deep, he crept in furtively, scheming to purloin a horse and flee. He managed to ready a mount and prepared to abscond, but then he registered something else. One of the traders was assaulting a native woman. Glass hesitated for a heartbeat, then reached a decision. He intervened, seizing a musket and training it upon the brute, compelling him to desist. The woman exploited the opening, snatched a blade, and exacted her own recompense. Concurrently, Glass discharged the weapon at another trader and made off on horseback. As he galloped away, Bridger's canteen slipped from his gear unnoticed. By daybreak, the Ree overtook him. They assailed him without preamble, forcing Glass to spur the horse harder whilst striding to fend off the attack. The pursuit turned treacherous, and abruptly, both mount and rider plummeted from a sheer precipice. Branches shattered the descent, sparing Glass's existence. The horse was less fortunate. As the snowfall thickened, he made a desperate gambit. He slit open the horse's belly and wormed his way inside the steaming cavity, utilizing the carcass as a bulwark against the killing frost. It preserved his life until morning. By sunup, he extruded himself from the gore and trudged ahead, still propelled by the same unyielding design. Back at Fort Kiowa, a French survivor staggered in, enervated and begging for charity. He pleaded for victuals, elucidating that the bulk of his outfit had perished in the snow. The fort's denizens insisted he surrender the stolen pelts, but he possessed nothing left to remit. As he emptied his meager belongings, Bridger's gaze fastened upon his water bottle. He instantly interrogated the man, who recounted where he had procured it. Upon hearing this, Bridger and the others dared to believe that Hawk might still draw breath. Without a moment's vacillation, they embarked on a search party. Fitzgerald, however, tarried behind. He knew the grim truth and elected not to participate. The quest stretched through the frigid night, and at its conclusion, they located a figure. But it was not Hawk. It was Glass. The following day, Captain Henry returned to confront Fitzgerald, only to ascertain that the scoundrel had already absconded, having plundered the strongbox prior to his flight. This perfidy redirected Henry's fury onto Bridger, who stood rooted to the spot, suffocating under the weight of his complicity. For a fraught instant, it appeared Henry might surrender to his rage, but he restrained himself. Instead, he commanded the men to escort Bridger away and confine him. Afterward, Henry turned to Glass and offered a muted apology for the calamity that had befallen him. Glass absorbed the words, then stated that Bridger was blameless, a boy who had not grasped the scope of Fitzgerald's deceit. He petitioned Henry to release the lad. Then, without hesitation, he requested a weapon and a horse, cognizant that Fitzgerald was craven and on the run. And so, Glass and Captain Henry set out to track the fugitive. It was not long before Glass discerned the spoor in the snow. The trail was unambiguous, and they pursued it without respite. That night, as they bivouacked, Henry unburdened himself regarding his own family, speaking softly into the frosty dark. He then queried Glass one final time regarding the rumor he had heard. This time, Glass responded. He averred he had not slain a captain without cause. He had merely killed a man who was attempting to murder his son. The subsequent morning, they spied a tendril of smoke curling in the distance and knew Fitzgerald lay but a few miles ahead. Without squandering time, they divided their forces to sweep the terrain. Glass arrived at a deserted fire pit, the embers still radiating warmth, signaling the proximity of his quarry. Concurrently, Henry approached from a divergent bearing, only to blunder into an ambuscade. A gunshot reverberated through the wood. Glass sprinted toward the report, but found Henry already slain. His corpse had been scalped, staged to implicate the Ree. Glass hoisted Henry's body onto a horse and resumed shadowing Fitzgerald, his intent more crystalline than ever. After covering some ground, Glass halted and set a stratagem. He shifted Henry's remains onto his own mount, using it as a lure, then proceeded to a location he anticipated Fitzgerald would cross. As predicted, Fitzgerald soon manifested and fired upon the decoy, believing he had neutralized Glass. Yet the moment he registered the ruse, it was too late. Glass shot him through the shoulder. Fitzgerald managed to flee, plunging deeper into the forest. Glass pursued without compunction. The hunt culminated beside a creek, where they grappled with whatever tools came to hand: knife, hatchet, and bare knuckles. The struggle was savage and wearying. Both combatants bled freely, yet Glass pressed inexorably onward, animated by the specter of all he had lost. Ultimately, he bested Fitzgerald and pinned him to the earth. For a suspended moment, it seemed the blade would fall. But then the re-materialized. Glass paused, recollecting the counsel of the Pawnee man who had once shown him grace. Deliberately, he relinquished his vengeance and thrust Fitzgerald into the current, surrendering him to the mercy of the Ree. Without a flicker of hesitation, they seized Fitzgerald and dispatched him. Glass remained where he stood, anticipating his own annihilation. Yet the Ree did not strike him down. As they filed past, he comprehended the reason. Among their number stood the young woman he had once defended, the chief's missing daughter. With her restoration, their errand was fulfilled. Glass was abandoned to the solitude. For a fleeting breath, a sensation of serenity washed over him. In his ultimate vision, he beheld his wife standing before him. She gazed upon him tenderly, then pivoted and strode away. Glass remained motionless, observing her dissolve into the horizon. He had forfeited everything, but he never ceased to crawl. Sometimes, that is the sum of what we can do. If this narrative stirred you, leave a like and pass it along to someone who needs a reminder of what genuine tenacity resembles. Subscribe for further tales of endurance and retribution.